1993. I was 15, and I know what I learned that year. Well, I learned that a car is something that someone will give away if it makes their life easier. I learned that not knowing how a carburetor worked wasn't going to stop me from taking one apart, rebuilding it and having it work. I learned that not all Marleys are good. I learned how to drive, and I learned that going sideways is a hell of a lot of fun. 25 years ago, and I don't seem any better these days at keeping a front end on a car, but I've realised something. Getting the rear end unstuck is just as much fun now as it was back then. We've had a terrible summer of weather, the kind of one that gives Ireland its bad reputation. Undeserved. Warm, yes it has been, but it's been raining every other half hour. So I was eager to get this car put back together, and I've hit the underseal with a top coat of stone chip. This is all new to me, and the reason I was doing this is that I don't get covered in underseal every time I touch something underneath the car. Now everything feels as good as it looks. And if you haven't noticed by now, I like to use my cars. So seeing the water bead off this is a hell of a satisfying thing. Okay, it's time to get the last parts off this. Then everything gets clean, prepped, painted and put back on. The only thing you need to know for now is I'm intentionally leaving a little tail of brake hose sticking out of the front calipers. If you've never needed a chiropractor before, this is the job that'll either make or break you. And amongst owners of our favourite fiberglass bodied car, it's known as the lotus position. Now you've got to drop the brake master cylinder and brake servo to remove the front anti-roll bar on a Mercedes W123. That's all fairly straightforward, but if like me you don't really want to disturb the cooling system, you've got to be prepared to give some of the pipework that travels from the engine into the heater matrix a good old stretch. There's one pipe in particular that you've got to be prepared to stretch a little bit if you want to get the ARB out. But it'll come. Alright, so that tail on the calipers. Let's just firstly make sure the union is free. And the bleed nipples on this car were so corroded, I knew that even a moderate twist on them would just shear them. So I reinforced them with some welds, and that worked nicely. But for now we're just freeing them up to make sure that they will come out when we need them to. And I know because of the state of these that this car hadn't had its brakes bled in many's a year. When it came to the brake master cylinder, I didn't want to get any undue dirt inside it, so I decided to make some bespoke plugs that I could fit to it to keep the dirt out. These are just your run-of-the-mill brake union fittings that you can buy in any parts store for pennies. and all I've done is welded the ends of them in so that they're sealed. I was never going to use these because I prefer to use stainless ones. Now here's one of those things that the manual is always just dismiss with a one-liner like, make all your preparations and then remove the Breakmaster reservoir. But it's never that simple. This reservoir, by the way, is about €200 to replace, which is in itself ridiculous. But it does not just pop out. And what I'm doing here with these picks was, let's say, brave, if not brazen. I was being very careful to never direct the point of the pick anywhere near the reservoir itself. Eventually though, it's one of those jobs where you just get to the point that you realise you're going to have to just exert more force until it comes out and pray it doesn't break in the process. Well, it didn't, and that's great. And I got lucky this time. And what about the absolute filth in this Breakmaster? It was covered in dirt, and you'll see soon the bottom of the reservoir had a layer of crud that had accumulated over 40 years. I never rebuilt a master cylinder before, so I was kind of excited to do this. It's an incredibly simple thing. It's just like a small row of plungers in line with each other. One or two operate the front circuit and one or two operate the rear circuit. And this cylinder is made by ATE for Mercedes. This is original equipment from the manufacturer, the real deal. And that's why I'm keeping it and not just buying a spurious part, which are readily available, because I've been bitten doing that on this car already. Let's just put that pot where it'll actually catch the runoff. Good work, you goose. As far as I can make out, the only thing of concern on a Breakmaster cylinder, as in the key criteria for it to work well, is that the bore stays in good condition. It's not corroded, rusty, pitted or scored. And the bore on this baby is smoother than the cream in a Twinkie. Word up. Continuing my experimentations, I'm going to hit this with the stone chip and see how it fares in the heat of the engine bay. But while we get on with other things, I'm going to give it a little squirt of WD-40 just to make sure there's no chance of the bore getting tarnished on us. Now, what about this reservoir? It's full of chambers, and at this point I wasn't sure I was going to be able to get all this crap out of it. And I started with some neat fuel, but it was a little bit old, so the octane levels were low and it wasn't cutting much. Looks like our reservoir is of a nervous disposition. But I ditched the neat fuel, and all this is dish soap in warm water. Brake fluid is extremely water miscible, which makes total sense when you consider how good it is at absorbing water. Well, it took a few goes and some careful teasing inside it with the toothbrush, but this thing came up beautifully. Alright, before we go any further on these calipers, we're going to make sure that they actually work well. The pads had loads of meat left on them, but that's something for later on. So I was going to use the old trick of running an air line onto your brake caliper to get some pressure onto the pistons and see if they're free. And this car had been in daily use right up to the point that I started to work on it, so I knew the brakes had been at least reasonable until then. And as it turned out, this wasn't one good piston and one sticky one. The calipers had corroded to such an extent that the oxidation in the grooves the pads run in was starting to grip the side of the pads. And this is where having the right tool makes life so much easier. The power file got straight down in here and took that rust right back. One word of caution: when you put pressure on these calipers with an air line, as soon as you take that air line off, the pressure is going to force any fluid left inside that caliper right back at you. And I feel it's my duty to point out that even given all the insult and injury this car has caused me, it giving me a golden shower is just, well, I should have expected it. Alright, hub rebuild. Now all I'm going to say about packing bearings with grease is I am going to get a bearing greaser packer thing machine job tool, because this was a pain in the neck. I'm not doing it nearly as aggressively here. You need to be slamming the bearing into your glob of grease to make sure the grease is forced all the way up into the bearing. Getting this properly packed with grease took way longer than you're seeing here. Now I'm not packing this little hubcap with grease until I actually fit the hubs. It's just going on to keep them clean in the meantime. All the steering link ball joints had life left in them, so they're going back on, and the job of tracking the car will be farmed out. You can see the little marks I made in the control arm, so I knew exactly where to locate the corresponding marks on the bushes. This confuses me because as soon as you fit these lower control arms and tighten up the bolt that holds them, the bush is gripped by the frame of the car. So when the control arm moves, the bush stays static. That's something I've got to do some homework on. Anyway, all of these components, now that they're fettled, prepped and rebuilt, are also getting hit with my new favourite thing, that stone chip. A It gives them a durable finish, but it can go on thin enough not to cause you trouble. You do, of course, have to be careful where you put it, because if it's in an interface between two parts and it's too thick, it could be dangerous. It's reassembly time. This was a day that was literally months in the making. The front anti-roll bar on this car can break. They have been known to. And it's this small, thin section that holds the bushes where they go. But thankfully, it's one of the few items on the inner side of this car that was in really good condition. Putting our new 50mm lowering springs into the front end of this car was a massive deal. It was such a relief, given that I'd never really planned to pull the front suspension out of this car at all. I've said it before, and I'd love to think I'd never have to think it again, but just restore a car. If it's got a few jobs to do the whole thing. It's worth it. It's definitely better than being caught out by just one more job after another that you didn't expect. I didn't replace all of the front brake lines, just this one, because the union disintegrated in my efforts to release it. But I did manage to kind of capture what happens inside a brake flaring tool when you're putting a flare at the end of a line. You want to see that again, don't you? The servo gets a coat of stone chip too, and something that some of our readers may find contentious. I did not replace the original seals in the master cylinder. I bought replacements, but it turns out you can't get, well, I couldn't get any brand that I recognised, and on close inspection I felt that the original items were better quality still than the new ones I'd bought. So the only seal I'm replacing on this master cylinder is the one that goes between the master cylinder and the servo to maintain the vacuum in the servo. And before you crack those knuckles and get punching on the keyboard, I'm more than happy to drop this master cylinder back off and refit new seals if the brakes wouldn't bleed. But as it turns out, the brakes have bled just fine, and we've got a very positive pedal in the car. Alright, in lieu of the proper equipment to dial in the preload on these bearings, I followed the manual which said, tighten the nut by hand, then back it off a third of a turn. Well, my third of a turn left it a bit loose, so I just kind of did it by feel. And I can't give you any more advice than that. But it's something I'll be checking back in on when the car's got a few miles under its belt. One last word on bleeding the brakes on a W123. The two little rubber caps that sit on top of the reservoir, if they are not in really good nick, you will not be able to use a pressure bleeder. And a pressure bleeder will make your life so much easier and the job so much faster. You know, it's funny. The underside of this car, okay, it's not perfect, but mechanically, it's almost like a new car. And then you look at the top side, and it's rougher than a Badger's undercarriage. But you know, I'm not fussy, and that's something I'll get to in another life. Alright, here's something I thought I'd try and capture, and I kind of failed. how a car settles after it's had its suspension rebuilt. I came up with a theory that a lot of it is down to the car being dropped back to the ground with the wheels in positive camber. And you can see it here, the tyre has come down with the suspension in full droop and met the ground and gripped, so the tyre has retained that positive camber. So I figured that the car would only have to move a couple of meters to release that grip of the wheels on the ground and return them to a more negative camber. So I gave it a push on camera, expecting to see the gap over the wheel tighten up a little bit, but I couldn't see anything. Now it turns out, if we really scrutinise the footage, it has dropped, just not as profoundly as I thought it was going to. And what I found over the coming days, especially after a couple of trips around the field, the suspension in the front has settled quite a bit. Now this is subtle, and it's a bit of a case of small and far away, but the gap, I think, even in this shot, does close slightly. Alright, we had a fully assembled car, save for a couple of components in the rear end I'd forgotten to fit. The rear anti-roll bar, its drop links, which again, in this shot, I forgot to fit a small shim that sits above them. And the rear dampers. So now all we need is somewhere to put the battery. And we've got ourselves a time machine. I'm punching it in. Summer 1993. Was I conspicuous in my absence? I'm sorry, what can I say? Tricky times. And I just want to say thank you for your patience, and especially for that of my patrons who fund all of this. I mean, it's as simple as that. So without further ado, to Fergal Patwell, Matthew Jenkins, Mark Byrne, Giacomo Renzo Battilana Verla. Hey, thank your parents for me, Giacomo. John Bacon, Yuka Agarpuro, Edgaras Kondratavicius, Joe Atkinson, Mbot1326, Abdul Ghaffur, Dale Mendelhall, Jimmy Ekstrom, Glenn Winter, Horatio Pitt, Sean Curran, JP Darling, Marco Neves, Ben Dunn, Callum Trapsky, Jack Stringer, Benson Ho, Ike Shomo, Neil Jarvis, Mark Berman, Paul Neely, John Shirtliff, Dorian Koppel, Joshua Stella, Ivana Burham, Sean Johnson, Martin Trice, Brendan Sheehy, Philip von Weiterhausen, Paul Abel, Stephen Grover, Tim Sermon, Justin Sterling, SC, Eric LaCapitaine, Andrew Lai Wing, The Keyboard Wizard, Paul Chapman, Philippe White, Puya Imami, Niall McHugh, Mark McConnell, Ralph Gome, Jamie Carson, Michael Farmer, Evan Van Steenhoos, David Holman, Patrick Noble, Richard Turbin, Joe Craver, Philip Griffiths, Katsuzuki Shigeta, James Cogan, Charlie Putt, Adam Banstrup, Paul Ryan, Roy Legister, Eric Dulong-Ray, and to all my patrons. Thanks for helping me get along. Please hit like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and if you've got something you want to let me know, drop me a comment. Things will pick up in the next couple of months, and I'll be back to a regular rhythm. Until then, stay stuck in, and good luck.